That is by two former colleagues. It will be given by two presenters, Andres Verzel, here up in the front, and Richard Pumpus. And the presentation will be on living with land subsidence, precarious livelihoods and policy responses, results of 6 case studies in the South, the global South. So please go ahead, Richard.
Okay, hello. Hello, everybody. First of all, nice to be here and share the presentation of our abstract with you. As Esther already introduced, we're showing the results of 6 case studies in the South. And while it's just me standing here now, and in a little while my colleague Andres, I should also note that we're here on behalf of our co-authors, and also particularly Jan-Willem Liebrand, who was the first author of the abstract underlying this presentation. But nevertheless, maybe first to get started, I would like to tell you a little bit about who we are. So the research group that conducted this research, I should probably start off by saying that we're not land subsidence experts. By any means, we're not geologists, we're not natural scientists, we're all mostly social scientists in our group that is called Diamonds in the Delta. And Diamonds in the Delta is a research action network consisting of scholars, so that's me, for example, of water professionals, and also of civil society advocates. And the last one is really important because what brings us all together is a shared concern of how climate change is compounding the effects of flooding and subsidence in urban cities, and particularly for the vulnerable communities, the poor communities that live in these cities. So this also brings us to a community-centered focus that we are proud of at our Diamonds in the Delta group, because we believe that the needs and experiences and aspirations of communities who are experiencing land subsidence and floodings every day should be the focus when designing, when implementing solutions. So therefore, we also advocate for including local knowledges and dynamics as key inputs for solutions, because we have previously observed that in the face of adversity, so when communities are vulnerable and when they're exposed to risks and hazards, they do not remain passive, but quite the opposite. They come up with creative coping mechanisms and adaptation strategies. And these are often informed by local knowledges of local social and ecological dynamics. So our intention is to not only foster collaboration and exchange knowledge between these six cases, but also, for example, at an event like this, to share what communities or how communities live with land subsidence, and to ultimately also hope that this informs policy. Also, what characterizes us is that we acknowledge difference, in the sense that we acknowledge that communities and individuals have different needs, aspirations, and experiences in connection to land subsidence, but also we acknowledge difference in power, and we acknowledge inequalities. So a solution for some might be a problem for others. And that's also why we like to think that we are a research action network, so we're action-oriented. So we do not just want to understand differeces and co-create and co-imagine more equitable and more resilient ways of living in flood-prone and subsidence-prone areas, but we also want to take a step back and understand the dynamics that causes unevenness in the first place, and then also try to challenge that. Also, something that we hold quite high is that we want to rethink and challenge the dichotomies that often guide the way we do science. So I'm speaking of, for example, the dichotomy between the urban and the rural, or the so-called global south, or the so-called global north, or the formal and the informal. And what we try to do at Diamonds in the Delta is bridge these dichotomies or overcome these dichotomies. So in simple terms, this means communities in the so-called global south learning from each other, but also us here in the Netherlands in the so-called global north learning from these southern communities. And overall, our research can be surmised as a joint learning approach. So this means sharing experiences among peers, so among these communities, among people who are living in the South, but also with us. This is a kind of iterative process. So when we collected the data and our whole group, the Diamonds in the Delta group, it's a longer term project where we engage in iterative dialogues with researchers, with actors who are involved. And we believe that through this longer term iterative dialogue, we can create a stronger basis for collective networked action. So very briefly, I would like to draw your attention to the overview of case studies. So I mentioned we had 6 different cases across 6 different countries. So there's the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, that is Manila Bay in the Philippines, that is Beira in Mozambique. Then we also have Barranquilla and the Magdalena Delta in Colombia. We have Semarang in Indonesia, and we also have the Kolna and Brahmaputra Ganges Delta in Bangladesh. Very briefly, I will not go through all the details here in this table, but this table is just to illustrate, first of all, who are the case coordinators responsible for this for these case studies. So it was not me, for example, that went into the field, but our partner organizations, and they had people responsible for collecting the data. So for example, for the case of Vietnam, this was Dang of Can Tho University. For each case, we selected a rural or an urban site or multiple rural and urban sites, also in line with kind of wanting to overcome or challenge these dichotomies of only focusing on the rural or only focusing on the urban. So we wanted to look at what can these 2 different localities learn from each other. And then we reported the problems that communities communicated to us. So in very simple terms, it just meant that researchers did interviews, did qualitative, very broad qualitative interviews, and asked communities, okay, what are the problems related to water and livelihoods that you experience? And we intentionally didn't ask them about land subsidence because we didn't want to prompt them into answering land subsidence if they were not thinking about that themselves already. And also because of this, you might see that here, if we look at the reported problems, some of them include land subsidence, but some of them don't, because this was not reported by people as something that they experience. And also from that, we also asked them, okay, you experience these problems, and what does it mean for your life? What are some material and non-material impacts? And here, I'm sure most of you are familiar with these type of impacts. It's a lot of loss and damage. So we have loss to property, loss to housing. We often have reports of people having to raise their belongings, putting the fridge on a little stoop, raising the road, putting their house on stilts. So there's a loss, also loss of life reported in our case studies, but also loss of quality of life. So for example, in the Vietnam case study, people also reported of their emotions, so of their emotional changes as a response to floodings and also land subsidence. But yeah, what is also interesting here for these cases, we also have a kind of coherent picture of loss and damages. But what we'd really like to draw your attention to is that perhaps there are also other things we can learn from these cases that are not just loss and damages, but for example, the case of Indonesia. A part of our research efforts were also producing video material. So our partners in the respective countries, they hired a documentary team, and they engaged and they interviewed these communities and filmed them. And I have a very short clip here showing an interview with 2 women in Demak, that is kind of a more metropolitan or rural region near Semarang in Indonesia. And the interesting thing about this video is it highlights how communities or these 2 women, despite living in a place where land subsidence is very prominent. I mean, I'm sure all of you are aware of Semarang. It's kind of the ground zero for land subsidence research and it being a global problem. Despite having to endure land subsidence, these women chose to stay. So in this very short 30-second clip, this woman reports that every year she has to raise her house by X amount, and this illustrates that despite there being, of course, always loss and damages associated to land subsidence and to floodings, maybe we can also conceptualize it as a story of belonging, because people choose to stay because something attaches them to these localities.
Iya, baturin gitu Pak. Tahu tak batur kok apa sih jenganu terus iki
Oh, sing
alhamdulillah.
riyen ngisor ngangge ya.
Nggih,
batur. Ngangge uruk.
Nggih, tibruk. Pun kula uruk ping sekawan Pak.
Sekali nguruk dulu berapa senti, Bu?
Nganu nggih setengah meter.
Setengah meter.
Sing niki 1 meter, Pak. Sing dhuwur niki langsung 1 meter, sing ngisor niki setengah-setengah, mawon kok tasik kelem terus.
Okay, and I should also note that this case is not unique, but also other cases Other cases in the village, other people living there were offered by the government to relocate. So the government allocated new places for them to move, but these women or this woman choose to stay despite that. Another interesting takeaway is that of diversity. So even though we have land subsidence problems and floodings and other problems related to water, these do not automatically always mean the same thing for people in one locality. So a very interesting case is the case of arroyos in Barranquilla in Colombia. Barranquilla is located at the northeastern coast of Colombia. And their flash floods are quite a big problem. So they occur whenever heavy rain pours down on the city. And as you can see here, this is in the southwestern part of Barranquilla. And the flash floods, they produce new lands. They shape the lands through erosion. And this means for many poor communities, for many migrant communities, often Venezuelan migrants, that they can benefit from these informal property rights. Because these lands do not belong to anyone officially. They built their sheds there, and they even connected, as you can see here, to the power grid. And they live there and benefit from these informal property rights, despite the risk, of course, of living in such a dynamic place. Also, what is happening is that these arroyos are used by garbage collectors. So there's people in Barranquilla going around with donkey carts, collecting people's garbage, and then dumping it in these arroyos, in these flash floods for a fee. So then you can also think about, okay, these flash floods also mean a livelihood for these garbage collectors. But at the same time, if we go, these flash floods also travel more into the urbanized areas, and there people only speak of it threatening their health and their quality of life, because all the garbage, of course, that is carried with these flash floods into the city, that ends up in the city.
The three? Okay, so that makes it that I will have to speed up a little bit. We have actually two more examples from Vietnam and from the Philippines. Just to really quickly recap on this one, what we found was that we studied in a rural and an urban area, and in the urban area they had this flooding in the streets and in the areas around it. The research in the rural area said that most of the problems of the communities came with riverbank erosion. There was a really heavy emphasis on subsidence research and programs related to subsidence in Can Thuy in the urban area, much less in An Giang in the rural area. But we found that somehow people are relating the riverbank erosion also to subsidence, to integrate it into what was obviously happening in the Mekong Delta and the attention that was given to land subsidence. Then, oh, sorry, am I missing one? Oh, that helps. So I don't know exactly what I've been doing, but so in the Philippines, to quickly recap, when we asked what was happening, people indeed indicated that there was a built area that led to subsidence as well as groundwater extraction. But they gave also all of these other comments, like narrowing the seas, reclamation of land, construction of fish points, dredging by some foreign company, poor drainage, solids waste, everything together was for them a reason of why the situation was that they every year experienced multiple floodings. And that kind of complexity should also reflect in how we started thinking about policies for subsidence and programs to tackle some of the problems that these communities have been dealing with. Then now I'm here. So I guess I have 1 minute, less even. So we have some concluding thoughts. One of them is that we really liked when we were invited to come here, that there was this emphasis on living with subsidence as an indication that there is a challenge to be tackled by all of us to to sort of connect what has been done by researchers to what is actually being happening in the field, and the idea of a worldwide challenge as it is promoted, that translates actually in many local challenges that all of these people have, and many like everyday politics that are related to subsidence, and that subsidence and programs for tackling subsidence also carries a kind of political weight to it, that some people benefit more of than others. I think I have explained the complexity and diversity a little bit. Then, yeah, so the integration work, I think it is good to briefly touch upon it, because what might be happening is that in a subsidence policy, it gets, even if you try to see it holistically, gets too narrowly defined because of what we saw in the Philippines. Maybe if you address some of these other issues, it is much easier to live with subsidence than it is now. And then as a final point, really thankful for the excursion yesterday. We went to see a photo exhibition about sinking cities by Cynthia Ball, and the examples there about some of the people in Gouda that we will be meeting, or some of you will be meeting tomorrow, on how they deal with it and how they actually are connected to Gouda, and besides all of the bad things, still want to fight for it and make a living. That is what we also saw in our cases, only the difference is, and that's why it says here that there is sometimes a gap between policies and local initiatives. The difference in, for example, Semarang is that the government isn't aligning with the policies of the people that also have a connection to the place, but suggests to relocate them. So I think that there's a lot to be learned from the resiliency, I'm not sure if I should say that, of these persons, and to use that when we are drawing or drafting our next policies. Thanks, and sorry for the delay.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting talk on livelihoods and subsidence, which of course is a very important aspect when designing new policies. So we have time for one or two questions.
Hi, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. And it's very interesting to see the social aspect of subsidence in different communities. And I was wondering, how do you contribute in networking these communities? Because it's also language barriers and cultural barriers. And can you have some words about this? Thank you.
That's the beauty of working in such a trans-local collective, that we collaborate with researchers from Vietnam, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia. So the fieldwork actually was collected by local researchers from these respective countries, and they then translate these findings and communicate them to us. And that also that's what makes the work so interesting, and so we're thankful for that.
Yeah. So these are actually 6 reports that are written by all of these people that are now not here. Who, what Richard said, they did the translating. There are actually people that many of them have a sort of connection to Utrecht University, so they speak English. That's how we've collected it. Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thank you. So you made a lot of observations, but is there a next step to translate that in policy or working with local governments?
By us, you mean?
Yeah, or this initiative. What is the next step actually? That's my question.
Yes. What the initiative wants to do is sort of put this out there, right? So it's difficult from what we have gathered now to come up with recommendations for policies. I think that the fact that if you hear these women talk and their voices are then sort of on the table, then that can be an input for policies in the next step. But from this research, that wasn't the intention. We looked at what policies are currently being implemented and what role people have with the government, and that showed this disconnect in terms of also faith that people had in it, or the solutions that were proposed by the government in terms of policies not aligning with what people actually needed or wanted to do.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions?
I want to say something about your. You gave an example suggesting that in the Netherlands we do a better job in aligning with local communities. I think there are some good examples. There are also a lot of bad examples. So this is the issue you raise is something that occurs in every community. And I'd like to invite people who want to discuss this a bit further into how do we as an expert community connect to politics, and how can politics connect on various levels with communities and experts. I think that's a topic of a poster I'm going to present just in this lunch. It's number 40, so everybody who is interested is welcome.
To clarify, it wasn't my intention to suggest that. Maybe for the speed that I went through the last part, and sort of the surprising encounter that I had yesterday with, or the day before yesterday with this photo exhibition, it may come off of that, but the point of departure of the entire network was actually to see what kind of local knowledges and ways of dealing with these daily problems there are in the Global South, and what can we learn from it for the case of the Netherlands.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then now I would like to thank you again.